This biotech startup thinks it can reverse vision loss and cellular aging. It's testing. The leverage shift starts now. Here is the signal that separates noise from actionable change. We will map trigger, incentive shift, and downstream impact before the close. This matters because if it works at scale, it rewrites the economics of aging, healthcare, and who gets access to longevity treatment first. Here's what's actually happening. The company is testing a novel approach that targets the cellular mechanisms behind both vision degradation and age-related decline. Vision loss affects 2.2 billion people globally, many of them working-age adults losing productivity and independence. Cellular aging isn't just about wrinkles, it's about mitochondrial function, protein quality, and the slow breakdown that drives diabetes, heart disease, and neurodegeneration. If you can slow or reverse one, you often impact the other. The therapy works on a principle that's gained serious scientific credibility over the past 5 years. Cells accumulate damage over time, but that damage isn't always irreversible. Senescent cells, cells that have stopped dividing but refuse to die, pile up in tissues and trigger chronic inflammation. Remove them or reprogram them, and you can restore function. The startup's approach appears to do both simultaneously, which is the novel part. Why human trials now? Because in preclinical models, animal studies, and lab cultures, the therapy showed measurable restoration of vision in damaged retinas and markers of cellular rejuvenation in aged tissue samples. That's the gate to FDA approval. But animal models lie constantly. A drug that works in mice fails in humans 95% of the time. So this trial is everything. It will answer 3 questions: does it work? Is it safe? At what dose and frequency? The contrarian angle that matters. Most longevity startups fail because they're chasing aging as a monolithic problem. This one is anchoring to vision loss, a specific, measurable, high-stakes outcome. That's strategically smarter. Vision restoration has a clear market, clear medical value, and clear regulatory pathway. If the therapy works for vision, the aging angle becomes a bonus, not the core bet. Who this impacts immediately: patients with age-related macular degeneration, retinitis pigmentosa, and diabetic retinopathy. These are progressive, currently irreversible conditions. Anyone in those categories who hears about this trial becomes a potential candidate. But the second-order impact is wider. If vision restoration works, ophthalmologists, geriatricians, and aging researchers will all shift how they think about cellular repair. Insurance and reimbursement models will follow. The India angle: vision loss is epidemic in India, 70 million adults with untreated refractive error, growing diabetic retinopathy from rapid diabetes spread, and limited access to expensive retinal therapies. If this therapy scales and becomes affordable, it changes outcomes for millions. But that's a downstream question. First it has to work, then it has to be priced and distributed in a way that reaches beyond wealthy markets. What to monitor over the next 90 to 180 days? First, enrollment speed. A slow enrollment signals patient hesitation or efficacy doubts. Second, any safety signals, whether participants report side effects that halt the trial. Third, interim data drops or press releases claiming even modest vision improvement. Those move stock and credibility. Fourth, competitor announcements. Other biotech firms are working on cellular senescence and vision restoration separately. This trial outcome will either validate the entire sector or cast doubt on the whole approach. The investment angle worth watching: if early phase data is positive, expect a funding round or acquisition interest within 6 months. The therapy addresses a $40 billion global ophthalmic pharmaceutical market plus an emerging $5 billion cellular senescence market. Pharma giants Roche, Novartis, Allergan are all fishing in this space. Here's the deeper implication. This trial isn't just about one startup or one disease. It's a test of whether we can actually reverse aging at the cellular level, not just slow it. If it works, it shifts the entire conversation from how do we help people live with aging to how do we repair aging. That's a fundamentally different medicine. And that changes incentives for every pharma company, every aging researcher, and every venture fund in the space. The timeline is critical. Phase 1 trials typically run 12 to 18 months. If interim data looks strong, the company could file an expanded access or breakthrough therapy designation with the FDA as early as mid-2025. That would mean some patients could access it before full approval. If data disappoints, you'll see a quiet wind down or a pivot to a different indication. Watch this closely. Not because it's guaranteed to work, most biotech bets fail, but because if it does, it's the leading edge of a fundamental shift in how we treat aging and vision. And that shift happens faster than most people expect once proof exists. This is the moment to understand the mechanism, the players, and the timeline. You'll need that knowledge when the data drops. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next.